really, when we leave a worship service, the only thing that should really matter is, did we glorify God? Did we honor God? Did we help our people remember who God is and what He's done? And oftentimes that's not the case. We leave worship and we are curious to know how many people were there, or we feel a sense of pride because the people really seemed to be engaged. There were lots of hands raised or loud singing, or we leave and we're in the depths of despair because it felt like everybody was asleep or stayed home, or all these things that are good things, right? It's good for our people to engage in worship, but when we take that good thing and make it a God thing in itself, we're elevating that to a point that's should be avoided.
Amen to that. This is the Serve Him Well podcast, episode 10. We are Jeff and Dana Banks, and we are so excited that you're joining us for our first podcast in 2018.
Yeah, it's good to be back, everyone. We've been a little MIA as we've been working through a pretty significant life and ministry transition.
Yes, off the podcast grid, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when we recorded our last podcast, we shared about the closing of Grace University, which will happen officially in May. And then as we were praying about the possibility of returning to pastoral ministry in a local church, well, in January, I accepted the position as senior pastor of Monument Bible Church in Scottsbluff, Nebraska. And we've spent the last several weeks transitioning into our new home and new ministry.
Yeah, so needless to say, it's been a little crazy, but a good crazy.
Yes, very good crazy.
Yeah, I think what's made it easier is just God has made it abundantly clear to us that, this is His calling for us, and it brings for myself a sense of calm even when we're busy and working hard and overwhelmed and all those things that come with transitions.
Indeed. Well, let's introduce our first guest for 2018. I had the opportunity to interview worship pastor Cody Villarreal of New City Church in Bellevue, Nebraska. This was our church when we lived in the Omaha area, and I've really appreciated Cody's servant heart, his humility, and his grace, and his skill as a worship pastor. Cody and I had the chance to talk about worship in the local church and some of the unique challenges in the area of praise and worship.
Yeah, aren't we going to miss Cody?
Oh, indeed. Yes.
I just loved worshiping with him and his team each Sunday. And, in listening to your interview, I've just appreciated hearing his wisdom and insight on worship in the local church. It's a great episode. So, and you know what, Jeff, would make this episode even better?
What would that be?
If we had a giveaway to go along with it.
That is a great idea.
Yeah, for sure. So in the interview, Cody recommended the book Worship Matters by Bob Coughlin.
Yes, it is a great book. I use that as a resource, a tool when I was pastoring in Iowa and had all of my worship team go through that.
Yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to give this book away for our listeners out there. You may want it for yourself, which would be great, or enter to win the book for someone maybe that's in worship ministry in your church.
That's right. Yeah.
So you can enter to win by going to our Facebook page or website at servehimwell.com.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. So, okay, let's turn our attention now to Jeff and Cody's conversation about worship in the local church.
Well, I'm really excited to sit down and talk about worship with my friend Cody Villarreal. Cody, welcome to the Serve Him Well podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks
Glad to be here.
Thanks so much. So before we jump into our topic, I want to just get a little bit of background and just tell us a little bit about your story of when you came to faith in Christ.
Yeah, I grew up in the First Baptist Church in Sway City, Iowa, a small little town there. And when I was about 11 years old, my mom sort of asked me if I wanted to have Jesus in my heart. And it was kind of a dual purpose question because on one hand, she cared about my salvation. On the other hand, our pastor was retiring and she wanted me to be baptized by him before he retired. So was baptized when I was 11. And I feel like it was after that I sort of began making my faith my own, asking questions, really forming my own faith beyond just accepting what I learned in Sunday school.
Sure. So as you grew in the Lord, in what ways did you start just serving Him? First kind of experience of doing that, maybe in the local church or just even outside the context of the church. What did that look like?
Yeah, through high school, my church was Well, my church youth group was about two
Okay.
people. And
Nice.
so we went to kind of another church nearby that had a larger youth group. And I started doing some music stuff there even, which was kind of a precursor. It was way, way before I even felt a call to ministry or anything like that. But started doing a little bit of music in that context, and sort of the same thing in college. Like, had some opportunities to just lead music for small, prayer groups or Bible studies, that sort of thing, and it grew from there.
So I know you've led worship at different churches. You've actually have taught some of that at Grace University with the worship bands there. So what led you to New City Church, where you lead worship at now?
Yeah, I had served lots of different churches over the last decade or so, and really found myself in a role where I was a little bit more of a paid musician than a worship pastor, and so found myself uneasy and looking for something new, and came in contact with Elvin Torres, the pastor at New City. And really just found both a ministry companion and a friend. Elvin and I are good friends, and as well as our wives and our daughters, our best friends, and so that was just a really good fit there, both personally and ministry wise. And it's a young church plant, and I have a heart for church planting, and so the rest is history, I guess.
So we talk about worship. Obviously, this is a huge topic. I mean, we could go in so many different directions, and we think about the gospel, and that from the scriptures from beginning to end, we see God's people as worshipers. And I think we maybe in our modern sense, maybe in our modern culture, because of the popularity of worship, people only think of that as music, of what we do, like when we sing on Sunday morning. So beyond that, how would you define worship in a broader scale?
Sure. Yeah, over the years, I feel like I've had a lot of different definitions of worship, how to really describe it well. And I feel like now at New City, we have something that is really clear and easy to use. And so I credit Elvin Torres for coming up with this, but we talk about worship as giving God your attention, your affection, and submitting to his authority. So really it's kind of like, your head, your heart, and maybe your hands, what you think, what you love, and what you do. And so I think that is a broader definition beyond just, musical worship on Sunday. What we think about, what we love, and what we do, if it's always in submission to God, it can be worship.
When we talk about worship at the church level, or at least a Sunday morning worship, that's a big part of when God's people gather together on Sunday. As you think about that, are there some primary goals, 2 or 3 primary goals that you're saying, hey, when we come together, when I'm wanting to lead people into worship, what are those goals for you as you think about that?
Yeah. Every Sunday, or just about every Sunday, I start by inviting the church to stand with us and to turn our head and our hearts to the Lord, turn our minds and our hearts to the Lord. And I think there's something significant in that as we come to worship, really anytime we come before the Lord, we need to be reminded of who he is and what he's done. And so if our worship does a good job of describing who he is, and I mean, he is indescribable. So to do that in an hour setting on Sundays is impossible. But if we're doing our best to describe who he is, and instill a sense of his person and his transcendence and his immanence, and then if we're also being reminded of what he's done, the story of the gospel, the story of the Bible, I think those are the primary goals for me when I come to a Sunday gathering or any worship gathering.
I love that. I think that focus of that reminder, that we're remembering who he is.
Yeah, I wrote a blog post once that my mom and 2 other people read. That, the title of it was that worship leaders are the CROs of the church, and the CRO stands for Chief Reminding Officer.
Yes,
kind of cheesy, but
no, I think that captures
on.
it. Yeah, it does catch on. And kind of a side note, maybe a little bit of a something that ties in there, but I wanted to get your heart on, because worship has become popular. Worship is something, I think worship music is more popular maybe now than it's ever been. And this idea of churches can become known for their worship.
Sure.
The sense of entertainment. How have you wrestled all of that through in your ministry? Because I think there's always a pull there in our hearts in some way.
Yeah, I feel that. I feel that even now, on a fairly regular basis. I think, there is something about being on a platform or on a stage, and being viewed using the gifts that God has given you. It parallels pop culture. It parallels, just popular music. And I think there is a difficulty. I think it's a real easy snag for Satan to use for worship leaders. That call to fame, or even if it's not necessarily, I want to be the next Hillsong, but just enjoying the spotlight.
Yeah.
It's definitely a dangerous risk, I think, for worship leaders. And there's so many. I mean, we could do a whole podcast on the risks or the idols that can come up as a worship leader. But just comparing. I struggle with that a lot. We're a smaller church. We don't have fog and lights and lasers. And I'm sure if we were a larger church, Alvin wouldn't let us have fog and smoke and lasers. But you see churches like Hillsong or even just churches in town that have that sort of worship experience, and it's just different than the way we do things. And if you're not careful, you can sort of be drawn into that struggle, I think.
Yeah, I think it's so well said. And I think, again, we could have a whole nother podcast on that whole idea of right aesthetic, how we could use aesthetics in a right way, or where the line is there, and where does it cross to where our focus is on something else other than on the living God who we're there to worship. So what do you think would be the primary role of the worship leader and team? So we talked about worship and kind of the goal of worship service. What do you think the role of the leader and the team should be?
Yeah. Again, going back to being kind of the chief reminding officers of the church, really just pointing, we're just I don't know, there's lots of analogies. We're just a lens or something pointing to the glory of God, and reminding people of who He is, what He's done. And really, it's as simple as that. I think sometimes we make it more, that we have to facilitate a atmosphere, or we take too much responsibility, I think.
Yeah.
To be totally honest, I think really, if we just point and we get out of the way, get out of our own way, and we just point to Jesus, that's the best thing we can do.
What factors should influence the choice of songs that we sing? There's so many songs you could sing. You could play the whole debate from traditional to contemporary and anywhere in between. But just from your process as you think through the songs we sing, what factors influence that for you?
Sure. Yeah, I think when you think about choosing songs, there's I feel like there's more songs now in the world than at any other time in history. So we have so much to choose from. And really the most important thing would be that it's theologically correct.
Yeah.
So I never want to bring a song to the congregation that's heretical or, and again, as we've said, we're reminding them who God is and what He's done. We're also putting words in their mouths, literally. Like the songs we choose are coming out of the mouths of our congregations. And so it's definitely important that it's theologically correct. A step down from that, is a little bit more of a philosophy. You mentioned kind of traditional, contemporary, maybe ultra modern, like rock and roll. Like what's kind of the philosophy or the mindset of your church? Are you a real heavy seeker church? And if so, you may not do the songs that are really, really theologically rich and but almost inaccessible sometimes for new believers. So you kind of have to find songs that fit into that. And then a step down from that is just really practically like, what does your congregation sing? What are their preferences in some ways? And the difficulty there is, most of our congregations aren't cookie cutter, people that are all exactly the same. So you may have a large group of people who love hymns, and then a large group of people who love country and folk music, and then a large group of people who love rock and roll. And, they want all of these different expressions. So how do you lead this group of people? And so I guess the short answer would have been trial and error.
Yeah.
You try some songs.
Sure.
I know I've tried songs that I thought, man, this is going to be a hit with my church, and they just didn't pick it up for whatever reason. And then, a good example is a couple Sundays ago, Elvin actually suggested a song that went with his message, and it wasn't one of my favorites. I didn't want to do it, but I did it anyway, and the church loved it. They they sang it super loud and really engaged with it. So a lot of trial and error, as long as it's not heretical.
Yeah, and I think the theology is certainly key there. We're teaching theology with the songs we sing. I love how you say
absolutely.
that. We're putting words in their mouths, and I think it's a challenge too. They're with the access to so much worship music on the radio or online, that there's people that want to sing songs that are just popular that they sing on the radio, but maybe they don't translate as well in the context of Sunday morning, or maybe the worship band can't pull it off like Chris Tomlin.
Exactly.
So, that makes it challenging too when you're putting that together.
Yeah, when you say the theology, I believe it was Bob Coughlin, one of my sort of mentors, I guess, in worship, that said that if you want to know the theology of a church, just look at the songs they've sang over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And that's so much more even than the sermons they've preached, because hopefully you're preaching the Word of God, but you're really forming your theology when you sing it.
That's so true. So on Sunday morning, how do you balance your leading, your exercising your gifts? Are you able to worship in that moment while you're doing that? Is that possible? Is there a balance there? Yeah.
Yeah. I think if you're doing it well, if you're doing it right, you are as much a lead worshiper as you are a worship leader.
Right.
I also think that there is a leadership element to it. And so leading with sort of one eye on the Lord and one eye on the congregation, like not just being so lost in your own worship that you have no idea what's going on in the room around you. There's a balance between those things, but I definitely think that it's better to lean on the side of being a lead worshiper and really worshiping yourself, because I think that's what draws people in to worship with you or alongside of you.
So how do you, at New City, you talked about it being a little bit of a smaller church. In that setting, how do you recruit and train worship teams? What's that look like?
Yeah, that's a convicting question, because I right now have one solid drummer, one solid bass player, and two solid piano players. So I probably need to get on the recruiting trail just a little bit. But I think there's also an element in a smaller church to trusting that God has the people there who He has, and there's your church isn't insufficient, or God's not failing you because your church doesn't have a bass player, or God knows who's there, and so letting those people serve and grow in those roles, and for whatever that looks like, God places those people there for a reason.
So what is your philosophy regarding excellence? So we want to,
sure,
and it's even like, this is almost that hard to ask question, tension of like worship. We're worshiping God. It doesn't have to be perfect. He sees our heart. We don't have to sing the right notes. And yet there's this weird tension there of excellence, not perfection. Flesh that out for me, the way that you see that a little bit. Yeah. That's the ever present question, because you can involve a younger
younger guitar player, perhaps, that's just taking lessons. But at the same time, if he's constantly playing wrong notes and he's a distraction to those who would, if the congregation finds themselves watching him, more so than reflecting on the Lord. And that can go the other way too. Like, it can be someone with extremely, developed gifts, that can be a distraction because their excellence in playing is not necessarily excellence in worship, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
And, this is one that I've struggled with over the years because I've seen worship bands that were just full of excellent musicians, literally world class musicians,
right?
That congregations just didn't respond to, and constantly felt like, man, do these people know what they're listening to, and that kind of an attitude. And but then I've also seen those kids who are just starting to play guitar. I was that kid, and you see like a mission trip worship experience where you don't even have guitars. You're in third world country, and the worship is so expressive and so rich and full of life. And so musical excellence, long story short, I think can really, really, really add to the worship experience, but it's not an end all be all.
It's not dependent upon that,
Absolutely
right?
not.
Yeah, and I think we're begging in that space for the Spirit of God to
Absolutely.
move.
Yeah.
Although we're trying to give our best.
Right, and I would add that God gave us music. God gave us music, and excellent music does something, right? So you go to the symphony, and you hear this moving piece that does something in you as a human being. And I believe God gave us those connections to music, and so why would we not tie those this musical experience, this physical human experience of really, really great music to the most important truths of our life, right? Like that to me is what excellence on Sunday morning looks like, is both moving music and moving lyric that mesh together in a way that's very beautiful.
It makes me think of the Psalms, I believe, like a translation, one of the places where it talks about playing skillfully.
Yeah, Psalm 33. Psalm 33:3 talks about playing skillfully on the instruments, but making a joyful noise. I've always loved that contrast, because the instrumentalists ought to play with some skill to supplement the voice of the congregation. I've often said that the most important instrument on Sunday morning is the voice of the congregation.
Yes. And the tension of all that, again, to me just lies in that all of this is not for us, right? Like what makes good, like we leave, oh, that was great worship. We think about that in the context, and we might feel that, but a sense of, I just wrestle with what makes great worship is I just want God to be glorified, God to be glorified in the midst of what's happening there. So that's just really good thoughts. What encouragement would you give to lay worship leaders who maybe lack some of those gifted musicians, limited budgets? How could you encourage them?
Sure. Again, I would go to, you can have a worship experience with a crappy acoustic guitar and a lively congregation. I think there again, we serve the God who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. So if he wanted you to have that brand new synthesizer or that, that $10,000 drum set, you would have it. There's no doubt in my mind. And so I think, sometimes God gives us situations, and we just need to be content. And then other times I think, we need to really be shrewd and be, as effective as we can in using what we do have in terms of budget or, the musicians that we have. One thing that I've started doing several years ago, just to give a real practical example, as I started using click tracks and sort of supplementing the musicians I had on stage with pre-recorded tracks and that sort of thing. And, some people may have opinions against that or for that. I've personally found that to be incredibly helpful in singing songs that, otherwise the musicians that I had at the time would have no business playing this song or that song. Or, I don't always have a horn section, or lead guitar players that can play these awesome parts. So if you can get them on a pre-recorded track, the other kind of side benefit to doing that is that your team is playing with a click track, which that metronome just makes you're never too fast or too slow. You're always right as long as you're with the track. And so over the years that's really been helpful to me to have supplementing the group that I have.
Nice. Cody, what are 2 or 3 things that you would say, hey, let's absolutely avoid this as a lead worshiper or for your worship team?
I think the obvious one there is ego. I think that's one of the hardest things to overcome is when, whether it's within the team, you have a clash of personality, or whether it's maybe within the staff, if your relationship isn't great with your pastor, for example, those things can just really weigh down a worship team super quickly to where those other things become the focus, and reminding your people of who God is and what He's done becomes a afterthought. And I think another thing to avoid is idolatry in worship. And what I mean by that is really when we leave a worship service, the only thing that should really matter is, did we glorify God? Did we honor God? Did we help our people remember who God is and what He's done? And oftentimes that's not the case. We leave worship and we are curious to know how many people were there, or we feel a sense of pride because, the people really seemed to be engaged. There were lots of hands raised or loud singing. Or we leave and we're in the depths of despair because, it felt like everybody was asleep or stayed home or all these things that are good things, right? It's good for our people to engage in worship. But when we take that good thing and make it a God thing in itself, we're elevating that to a point that's should be avoided.
Amen to that. You mentioned ego, and maybe just a follow-up question here. Talked about whether it's on the team, your relationship with the pastor. I mean, in your experience, is the best thing there just openness and a good, deep, hearty conversation with the person, face to face?
Absolutely. I think we're not robots leading worship. We're people, and we're sinful, and we fail each other, and we fail ourselves, and it's so important to have that kind of relationship with especially with your lead pastor as a worship leader. There's no more important relationship within the church than for a worship leader, at least, than with the senior pastor. And so just having a relationship with that person and with everyone on your team, that is, is just, it's being a disciple. It's being open to criticism, but being able to deliver that in a way that's grace filled and honoring to each other. And we're gonna fail at this stuff. There's no two people who could work in a church or serve in a church together that will never ever have conflict. And so, I think the more we can sort of lay ourselves down and again, going back to ego, like the more we can lay down our ego and be humble in those relationships, the more often we will see benefit.
So for some of our listeners that might need some help in the area of being equipped to maybe apply some of these things we've talked about, what are some great resources that you've found that you could recommend that would really encourage and equip those people involved in leading worship?
Absolutely. So if you are leading worship, and maybe you're early on and kind of developing, one of the books that was influential in me when I was sort of in that phase of life was Worship Matters by Bob Coughlin.
It's so good.
It's just a great practical kind of guide as to who a worship leader is, what he should do. There's just so much really, really practical information in that book. Coughlin actually wrote another book in more recent years. I can't fully recommend it because I haven't actually read it myself, but it's sort of like the layperson's version of Worship Matters, and it's called True Worshipers by Bob Coughlin. And so, if you're not a worship leader listening, but you are a worshiper and want to kind of go deeper, that's maybe a good resource, and you could let me know what you think.
Yeah, I'm gonna put that on my list. Yeah.
Awesome. The next one I would recommend for worship leaders would be Rhythms of Grace by Mike Cosper. It's a little bit more of a flowery kind of description of worship, but man, it's such a good resource to think about what we do when we come to worship, and really in the context of the worship gathering being that reminding of who God is, in a full sense of the gospel, that, we come, to get off on just a small tangent, when we think of like a worship order of worship, the beginning, we're thinking of who God is, and we're thinking of his excellence and his how amazing God is, right? We're adoring him, and then we move into this time, oftentimes of recognizing our sinfulness, sort of reflecting on who we are in light of that, and that's the gospel experience,
yes.
Right? You recognize who God is, and it instantly reminds you that you are not God, and very much in need of him. Then you receive sort of this assurance of the grace that Jesus has given because of what he's done. And so Rhythms of Grace by Mike Cosper really starts to hammer that nail. And the last one that I would recommend, it's a little bit more of a heady theology, but it's still that same thrust, and even maybe more so, is Christ-Centered Worship by Brian Chappell. Chappell's really gonna hit that over and over and over, and actually shows throughout the course of history how people have used that same liturgy or order of service to reflect the gospel in worship. And so those were super formative on me when I was first starting to lead worship, in terms of how I ordered songs and services, and I still think in those terms every single Sunday when I'm putting songs together.
We'll be sure to include the links to these resources on our show notes at servingwell.com/10. Cody, thanks so much for being a guest on the Serving Well podcast.
You're welcome. I love talking about this stuff, and I just want to say too that we at New City are going to miss you guys so much as you transition into a new season of life. But I'm so excited to see what God does with the Banks in the coming years.
Thanks, my friend. I really enjoyed sitting down with my good friend Cody Villarreal to talk about worship, and it made me think of one of my favorite books of the Bible, the book of Hebrews, and the unique, amazing blessing that we have in the new covenant because of Jesus' priestly work and what he's done for us. In Hebrews 12 and 13, there are a couple of exhortations that impact our ministry and especially our worship. The first is Hebrews 12:28. It says, "Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful. By it we may serve God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire." And so because of Jesus, we just have these grateful hearts, and a heart that's overflowing with gratitude that would lead us like in a very priestly way to serve God, our great high priest. And then the second one is in Hebrews 13, verse 15. It says, "Therefore, through him," that's Jesus, our great high priest, "let us continually offer up to God a sacrifice of praise that is the fruit of lips that confess his name." So because of Jesus, we're grateful and we serve him. And because of Jesus and through Jesus, our great high priest, we offer up to God a sacrifice of praise. It's the fruit. Worship is the fruit that is produced by those who confess the name of Jesus. And so we have the joy and the honor to do that individually in our lives each day as followers of Jesus, and of course, corporately when we meet together as believers. Thanks again for listening.